Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Blane Lowe about vaccine efficacy and how ranchers can work with their veterinarians to establish a vaccine protocol that works for them. Now, this is going to be a little off topic, but I just want to send some good thoughts and vibes to everyone who is calving, selling bulls, buying bulls, and just in the thick of March. It is a busy month for many of us, and at the time of recording this, my husband and I are preparing for calving, and my parents are preparing for a bull sale, so I get it. And one tip that always helps me get through busy seasons is to list 3 things that I'm grateful for. It helps the good days feel great, and the bad days feel better. But with that, I don't want to take too much of your time, so let's visit with Blane about vaccine efficacy and how we can get the most out of those programs.
Want to boost your ranch profitability? Choose Red Angus. Celebrated as the beef industry's most favored female, Red Angus cattle are a consistent source of traditional Angus traits, including carcass quality, maternal characteristics, calving ease, and moderate size. Over the past decade, Red Angus registrations have surged by 24%. Elevate your herd with Red Angus by heading to redangus.org to connect with the Red Angus team.
All right. Well, Blane, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast this morning. While we've only talked on the phone once before, I'm really excited to visit with you, especially about this topic where we're going to dive into some best practices for handling vaccines and also maybe some veterinary client-patient relationship tips as well. So the question I always ask guests before we dive in, and it's always kind of a hard-hitting question, is why do you believe in the beef industry?
Well, I think I grew up around it for one thing, but then certainly most of my professional career has been involved with beef cattle. You know, the history of cattle and mankind go back centuries. I mean, it's discussed in biblical terms. I think the biggest thing is if we look even around the world, about 1/3 of all of our acres are suitable for just about nothing more than growing grass. And so how do we get a nutrient that we can't access as humans into something that's a high quality, nutrient dense food product for us? And cattle are one of the champions and long-term champions of taking that grass and converting it into usable protein for us to eat. Plus, it's tasty and enjoyable.
Well, that last bit about how cattle are kind of superheroes with being able to utilize that land and that grass, that gets brought up quite a bit, but I have not had someone bring up kind of the history of how far back the relationship between human and cattle go. So I'm glad you brought that up because that's a new perspective for that question.
To our topic of today being vaccines, we have the term vaccine from cows. And, you know, the story of Edward Jenner, if anybody would like to Google that and read in further detail, basically the observation that the milkmaids in England, this was back in the late 1700s, the milkmaids would have cowpox lesions on their hands, but the rest of they weren't decimated by smallpox. And vaccine comes from vacca, which is the Latin term for cow. So basically that's named the whole industry of what we know about vaccination and vaccinology.
Very interesting. I had heard that story, but I forgot about it. So tell us a little bit more about what you do today and kind of why you're today's experts on vaccines for this audience.
You know, I'm a little bit older, so I'm in my career maybe towards the tail end, but I spent 23 years with various companies manufacturing vaccines and pharmaceuticals for livestock use and production. So I practiced 5 years before that in central Nebraska. And my wife and I just got moved back here. So basically my entire career has been with livestock production from the beef cattle end to educating. I was on faculty at Kansas State University for about 4 years while I was pursuing a graduate degree. I went to work for industry and actually did a stint in research and development and then technical services for a number of years.
Awesome. So when you think about whether it's ranchers utilizing vaccine programs or feeders utilizing vaccine programs, what are some of the biggest mistakes or missed opportunities you see people make when they're utilizing vaccines?
Probably the biggest thing is something as simple as reading the label. Every vaccine comes with a label. Commercial product comes with a pretty detailed label and a package insert. And I think I can maybe pick on my own profession a little bit, is that we don't take the time to read those. If you've read any given product, you read that vaccine label 2 years ago, they update those continuously, and there may be something in there that you need to know. So, certainly familiarize yourself with what you're going to be using and then use them according to the label. There's been some really interesting shortcuts that people can take or have taken over the years. I don't recommend them, but they say, well, I only want to give one shot, so we mix a Bactrim in with a modified live viral product, and that's really a no-no, because if you can combine those products, the companies will do that, which we certainly have done with things like our viral BRD vaccines, along with the manhemia, which we know is the biggest challenge to producing beef when we get to certainly the stocker and the feeding phase of the operation.
What about when it comes to mistakes made with maybe mixing those modified lives or just on working days where you're working outside? Can you talk about some of those efficacy tips to make sure that you're not harming that vaccine?
Well, that's a great point. And people think that they'll have the cake in the bottom of a modified live, and then they'll have the liquid that they put in there to dissolve it, if you will, and mix it up. And then people will make a mistake of taking that and agitating it, over-agitating it, we'll call it that. They shake it really hard. And if you're shaking that thing hard enough to get bubbles in there, you're probably denaturing some of that and rendering that vaccine unusable to the animal. Because what we're doing with that modified live is we're putting a tamed down bug into our animals, and then that's supposed to replicate and grow within the animal to generate the immunity that we want. And if you've denatured that by shaking it, so just gentle inversion, and then maybe even just swirling it around like you would a glass of wine, that's sufficient to get those things mixed appropriately, and they're effective. The other thing with modified lives is you should use as fresh a product as you can, and only mix what you're going to use within the next hour. You don't want to be mixing up 300 doses and then let them sit in the sun, or go to lunch and then come back and finish working your cattle. But those are just little key points that those are covered well in BQA materials, and I think education is critical, and you're doing that through forums just like this, so it's very good.
So you brought up don't let it sit in the sunlight, and that's something that's shared a lot in educational materials around this, but can you remind us why we don't want to let those vaccines sit in the sunlight?
Going back to the being a modified live virus, we want that to be live going into the animal when we place it under the skin. So sunlight is a very effective disinfectant. So when you think of any biosecurity, the more sunlight, the more drying that you can get, the better off you are at lowering an infection in a production setting. So if you're letting that vaccine sit out there in the sunlight and Most of them are coming in clear bottles. The ultraviolet light can get through there, and it will inactivate those viruses.
Okay. So, but you still don't want your killed vaccines to sit in the sunlight either, correct?
No, I mean, you want to keep them, cool and shaded. Absolutely. And certainly if, where I live and where you live, the temperatures can get quite cold. You don't want to be thawing out and using anything that may have gotten frozen. So certainly pay attention to those things.
So in those colder environments where maybe people are working outside in the winter, because not everyone has that indoor facility, and not all indoor facilities are heated by any means either. So with that, is it something where you're recommending people try and keep it not maybe right up against a heater, but near a heater to control temperature, or in the cab of a pickup? How have you helped clients or seen clients kind of maintain that temperature range?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's going to keep it, in its liquid form is going to be helpful. You don't want to overheat it, of course, but the radiant propane heaters will work well. And, you can just set them on a table and have the radiant heater projecting onto your work area, and, make sure that you've got the vaccines and, the syringes sitting out there. Keeping a cooler, a good cooler close by, to where after you've mixed something, you draw up your first doses of that. You might set the bottle, if it's a multi-dose vial, you'll set that back in there just to keep it not only at a respectable temperature, but keep it away from the sunlight. So the other thing is you should, particularly with the modified lives, designate one pistol grip syringe for that, and that's what you're going to use. You are going to be given your clostridials or your blackleg vaccines, and then all of a sudden go over and use that one for your modified lives. That's not a very good practice.
Support your cattle's health and productivity with Vigortone minerals. Since 1912, Vigortone has been a trusted name in animal nutrition. The revitalized product line offers targeted nutrition for every stage of production and every region. Vigortone delivers consistent performance and simplifies your mineral decisions. Wherever you are, Vigortone works. Visit Vigortone.com to learn more, and that link is also in the show notes.
So I do want to talk about, or hear your thoughts on, cleaning syringes, because I know that's something that I've heard as well. But before we transition into that, is there anything else you want to touch on related to those cattle working days where you're handling those vaccines?
The cleanliness is really good. I'm glad we're going to transition into that. But, like I said, go back to the label, follow the tenets of good vaccine handling and good vaccine practices. You use sharp needles, and appropriate length needles. If we look at all the things that we're going to invest in our beef herds, the overall objective of a vaccination program is to generate that immunity in the herds. When they encounter a wild virus or bacteria, they're less apt to get sick and lose the production. So that's important. You do give it with less than clean application techniques is not a good idea. If the weather and you're able to do this is not agreeing with you, particularly wet-hided cattle, you may want to postpone that for a day, or if you're able to do that. So just some things to kind of help the producer out. When we look at the cost of things, the cost of the most expensive vaccine you'll run into is the one that isn't doing its job. So if it doesn't work and hasn't given you the results that you need, you put that money down a raffle. So
Absolutely. The tools are there to help set us up for success, but we have to use them appropriately to do that as well. So transitioning into cleanliness with syringes, what tips or advice would you like to share?
Well, certainly, if we go back to the modified live discussion, you don't want any disinfectants or even soaps in there. So just good hot water is as good a clean that you can do. I like to have people clean up after they're done working, so I mean, start with clean equipment, and then when you're done, clean up that way, that stuff, so that it's sitting there ready to go for the next time you're bringing in cattle to be worked. So hot water, disassemble your pistol grip syringes, basically 3 to 5 flushes of water that's over 180 degrees. I mean, and we know we can get it to that if we just boil it. You can actually boil syringes and transfer needles. If they're plastic, probably just a good thorough rinsing is what we would like to see.
I do want to talk a little bit about, that relationship with clients and how to work with a vet to set up a vaccine program that works for you. But is there anything else related to the handling of vaccines that you think we should touch on before we completely shift out of that conversation?
Going back to the label, follow the label. If it requires a booster vaccine, make sure you get that in there. I mean, a practice that's been used for as long as I've been a veterinarian is with blackleg. The calves may get it at branding or grass turnout time their first year, and then they won't see it. The label says that should be boosted, or really to get the primary immunization 3 to 4 weeks after the first dose. The vast majority of cattle never get that. So the next time they see a clostridial or a blackleg vaccine is at weaning. So it seems like we have been able to get along with that and use that in the industry, but it essentially not according to the label. And, it works. So if it requires a booster, try as best you can to get a booster into it.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that's something that sometimes we kind of look for those shortcuts because we have a lot going on. But like you brought up earlier, the most expensive vaccine is one that's not doing its job because we aren't setting ourselves up for it to work like it's supposed to. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So Blane, we've talked a lot about using the vaccines, but in your mind, what can producers do to work with their veterinarian to find the right vaccine program that works for their operation? Because what works for me might not work for my neighbor, and especially across the state or across the country. So how can producers work with veterinarians to determine a vaccine program that's going to be most effective?
Well, that's a great question. I think, first of all, if you are never going to have a challenge, infection coming into your herd, in any vaccine, it's probably going to work really well, but is it going to work any better than no vaccine? So the producer and veterinarian need to get their heads together. What diseases are in a given geography a problem, and then set up the immunization, the vaccination program that's going to provide immunization, the immunity that they need when they're going to encounter those. A good example that pops into my mind is redwater. And if you get into, Idaho and the Gulf Coast states and even the Great Lakes areas, you can see people will give an 8-way clostridial or an 8-way blackleg. In the Sandhills of Nebraska, most people will give a 7-way because we don't have the flukes in there that are part of the whole pathogenesis of the redwater. So where you might need to give an 8-way in, Idaho Falls, Idaho, and some practitioners recommend every 6 months on cows, you can do really well with a 7-way in the northern Great Plains. So there's different geographic regions where the veterinarians are a good resource for the producer, and Do we need to, when are we going to encounter the disease? When do we expect that we're going to encounter it? And how do we get those cattle immunized before they face that issue?
Yeah, that is something that would be very important. And what about your veterinarian understanding kind of the full scope of your operation? Because a lot of people are diversified, and in that sense, if you're farming and have cattle or even other businesses outside of farming, that can impact how much time you have available certain times of year. So do you see that being an important part of that relationship?
I think it is. I mean, if you're prepared when you go into a wreck, it's always better than being caught off guard. But I think that goes back to, you had some questions, I think, earlier about VCPR, the veterinary-client patient relationship. I think the veterinarian is critical for that. And when we look at the amount of money and capital that are invested in, just the cows today at the current markets, plus the feed, the resources, and the feed, whether you're buying the feed and doing it in a dry lot, or you're on the grass or have to lease the grass to get into those cattle. The vaccination program is a fairly small cost in relation to all those other things that we do with those cows. And preventing that disease is going to help them be productive, help the herd be productive, and get the results that we want.
Calling all ranchers. If you are looking for a better way to optimize your grazing operation and rev up your bottom line, Noble Research Institute can help. Noble's team of ranch managers and researchers work together to find solutions to your challenges. They don't just give you answers, they can help you understand how to apply their research-tested and field-proven principles on your ranch. Visit noble.org to learn more and browse Noble's educational resources. So when you think about that VCPR, if you could describe an ideal or a successful one, what would that look like?
I think that, ideally, to your earlier point, that veterinarian knows more. He's not just, it's a two-way street. The producer needs to view the veterinarian as, that's not just who we call when things are going wrong, okay? We want to pick their brains, and the veterinarian needs to probably, book some time in their busy schedule to sit down and just say, okay, we're going to go through what we're doing for vaccination. We're going to try to anticipate the things that we know can go wrong, whether it's scours in the springtime, if we're in a spring calving situation, or if it's BRD at weaning time, or summer pneumonias out on pasture. How are we going to deal with those, set those things up, and actually be, a trusted advisor to that operation as they're progressing through their work?
Well, Blane, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, in all your years of experience and with the knowledge that you have built from that experience, what final thoughts or tips, or really, is there anything you just want to share with the listeners?
I would say that our industry does a remarkably good job of producing beef, right? And part of that is managing the immunity of those herds that we are under our care. So they're doing a good job. They need to just, whether it's through BQA, meetings, there's an abundance of meetings and resources that they can rely on to not only help the cattle, but to have the environmental stewardship as well, which is all part of the whole sustainability issues that we face and will continue to face. But we do an excellent job of producing, the best protein source. I'm biased, of course, but the best protein source we have available on the planet.
I mean, maybe it's biased for me to say it's the best too, but I think that could basically be a fact. All right. Well, Blane, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me today and share your knowledge with the listeners out there. I mean, this was a really practical episode and maybe just a refresher for some people. But for those of you out listening, like Blane said, we got to get the most out of our vaccines. We got to make sure that they work. And to make sure they work, we have to make sure that we are reading the label, we are using them appropriately, and we establish that good relationship with our veterinarians to set ourselves up for success.
Yeah, very well put. And I thank you for your time today and the questions. And I'm happy to visit about this because this has been my life's work, I guess, for lack of a better term.
What an important role to serve producers. So with that, for those of you out listening, remember the best way to support this podcast and your other favorite podcasts is to send them to a friend who would also find it interesting and leave a rating and review. And furthermore, if you want to connect with me and share your thoughts on this episode, any other episode, or have a suggestion for a topic or a guest, I absolutely love to hear from you guys as listeners. Nothing makes my day more than when I see an email or a DM come in on social media about you guys trying to connect. So head to my website, head to my socials, connect with me there. Have a great day, and happy ranching, folks.